Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Pressure Canning Basics with the University of Maine Cooperative Extension. This webinar is designed to provide you with current USDA recommendations for preserving food at home. I'm Lisa Fishman, and today I'll be focusing on how to safely use a pressure canner, and then we'll preserve some freshly picked snap beans using a pressure canner. Before we get started, I want to let you know that this webinar is set up so that you can hear and see me, but I can't hear or see you. I know you'll have questions though, and I want to be able to answer those questions. So please use the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen to type your questions into the Q&A box as they come up for you throughout the presentation. I'll be joined tonight by my colleague, Sharon Parody, who will be monitoring that Q&A box and making sure your questions make it to me. We will be covering the basics of how pressure canning works and why it is used to preserve some foods but not others. We'll spend some time demonstrating how to use a pressure canner and highlight the steps we use as part of our best practices routine for canning. Along the way, we'll answer your questions. And finally, we want to let you know that the University of Maine is prohibited from discriminating on the basis of race, color, national origin, sex, age, disability, and reprisal or retaliation for prior civil rights activity. We are filming tonight from the kitchens of Sodexo on the campus of the University of Maine at Fort Kent. Go. I want to make sure you can see me. We appreciate Sodexo's willingness to host our webinar tonight and to share their kitchens with us. Our goal in canning foods is to create a shelf-stable product that is free from spoilage organisms that could make us sick. In order to do this, we have to consider the methods we need to use for canning in order to destroy germs, molds, yeast, and other bacteria that could lead to food spoilage and foodborne illness. When we talk about home canning, we can divide foods into two groups, the high acid foods and the low acid foods. High acid foods are those foods that are either naturally acidic or have had acid added to them to make them high in acid. As you can see on this chart, high acid foods include fruits, some tomato products, including salsa, and pickles. Low acid foods are those that are not naturally acidic and have not had acid added to them. You can see on the chart that this includes all garden vegetables as well as meat. In order to destroy those organisms that could make us sick, we need to create an environment hot enough to kill microorganisms. With high acid foods, bacteria are already living in an environment that it's difficult for them to survive in. When we apply heat to 212 degrees, that's enough to kill microorganisms that could lead to sickness. For those low acid foods, those very same microorganisms are not killed at 212 degrees, the boiling temperature of water. They require a much hotter environment. Now, if I boil a pot of water, the temperature will be 212 degrees. If I boil that water for 5 minutes, or 10 minutes, or 60 minutes, will the temperature of the water change? No, it's a fixed temperature of 212 degrees. So cooking a food longer will not give me a safer product, just an overcooked one. The only way to raise the temperature above 212 degrees is to use a steam pressure canner, which reaches temperatures between 240 and 250 degrees Fahrenheit. A pressure canner uses steam in a sealed container to destroy any spoilage organisms that might be inside your canning jars. Together, steam and pressure allow us to heat our food to temperatures much hotter than boiling water. And it is these high temperatures that allow us to safely process our low acid foods like vegetables and meats. Low acid foods run the risk of allowing C. botulinum spores to develop into toxins if not properly heated, which can cause a type of food poisoning called botulism. The high temperature inside the pressure canner destroys any C. botulinum spores in your jars and creates a vacuum seal, which together make your canned foods safe for long-term storage. A pressure canner is the only way to safely can low-acid foods. A boiling water bath canner simply does not create hot enough temperatures to destroy C. botulinum spores. So we're going to talk a little bit about some equipment, and the very first thing that we need to talk about is the pressure canner itself. So to pressure can foods, you will need a pressure canner, not a pressure cooker. There is a difference between the two appliances. You're looking for a pressure canner. A properly sized canner will hold at least 4-quart jars, no less. Canners can be either of a dial gauge or a weighted gauge variety, and either one will have a rack inside to keep the canning jars off the floor of the canner. The lid of the pressure canner will have a gauge. It will have a vent tube, an overpressure plug, and some models may have a separate regulator. Newer models will also have a lid lock, which is a nice safety feature that has been added in the past few decades. The inside of the lid will have a gasket, a rubber gasket that is usually removable, and that helps keep steam from escaping, since it is the steam that creates the pressure inside the canner. Now, there's a lot more to talk about regarding the equipment needed for canning. We have only touched on just the canner itself. But because pressure canning takes a lot longer as a process to get going and see through to the end, we're going to actually move into the canning stage right now, and then we'll backtrack and talk about some of that more equipment in just a little bit. So the first thing you're going to want to do is make sure that you've washed your hands and that you've washed all your surfaces and you have prepared your food. I'm wearing gloves tonight because I broke one of the cardinal rules of preparing food safety, and I forgot to remove my nail polish. And so because I'm wearing nail polish and I am preparing food, I did choose to wear rubber gloves tonight, food grade gloves that I will be using. So one of the things we want to talk about is the produce that you'll be using. And I have fresh produce here tonight, thanks to UMFK and the lovely greenhouses here on campus that have been producing an abundance of green beans. I have a variety of yellow, purple, and green beans that were donated to me today so that we could do this class, and I'm very grateful for that. I made sure that if there were any rusted or discolored or partially deteriorating beans, I discarded those. I don't want to have any food that's already on its way to spoiling trying to be put into our food that we're trying to keep from spoiling. So when you're processing any foods, only use the highest quality, the best food that you can come by. It's not going to pay off in the long run to try to use a lot of bruised or partially spoiled and salvaged type of fruits and vegetables. Always go for the primo and you'll be happy with the end result, which will be a very high quality product. So when you are cutting up your foods for canning, we're trying to get heat to penetrate that food when we're canning all the way through in an even manner. And so it's important that your cuts of vegetables and fruits be as evenly cut as possible. So I didn't measure, but I did snap my beans, keeping in mind that I wanted to have pretty uniform pieces in there. I don't have any very tiny pieces that are going to be in the jars up against very long pieces. They're all fairly uniform in size, and that does matter. Many recipes that you'll be looking at will tell you that you can add salt. Older recipes will tell you to add salt. More recent recipes will tell you that salt is optional. And salt is indeed an optional ingredient. It's a flavor enhancer, and that is all it is. It does not do anything to the process of keeping our food safe. It doesn't add anything to the preservation piece of processing food. It is only there for flavor. So if you are using your home canned product to make homemade baby food, which is a terrific idea, or if you have someone in your family who's on a low sodium or restricted sodium diet and doesn't want to have all that extra salt in their home canned products, feel free to leave that product out. You don't need to add it. You can always salt and pepper at the table when you're serving your food. So that's totally permissible to do that. I do want to mention that the recipe, the guidance that I'm using tonight for processing these beans comes directly from the Ball Blue Book of Home Preserving. And it's the basic recipe for processing green beans or snap beans, which includes green or yellow, or in this case, purple. And another little change that we'll talk about before we get going is that in the past few years, guidance has changed from the USDA around sterilizing jars. And the recommendation always used to be to sterilize your jars for 10 minutes prior to using. And now that has been reduced somewhat. If your recipe is calling for a processing time of 10 minutes or more, then that sterilization step will be taken care of during the processing time, and there's no need to sterilize your jars. That's true for both water bath canning and for pressure canning. If your recipe calls for a processing time of less than 5 minutes, and there's not a whole lot of recipes out there that call for a processing time of 5 minutes or less, but we do see some pickles have a very short processing time. If your recipe calls for a processing time of less than 10 minutes, then you still need to go through the sterilization procedure. Just an extra step to make sure that any bacteria, any microorganisms are destroyed during this process. So tonight, because my processing time is 20 minutes, I will not be sterilizing my jars. That doesn't mean that I can just take jars off my shelf and fill them. I have gone through the step of making sure they were washed with hot soapy water, and that gave me an opportunity to check for any nicks or cracks in the jars. You always want to inspect your jars before you start to use them, as well as any other equipment you're going to be using. Always make sure it's in good working order before you get going. So tonight, we are going to fill a few pint jars and get them into our pressure canner. And then I'll backtrack and talk about the canner and other pieces of equipment. So I'm gonna start right in, and we're gonna switch cameras, I think, so you can see me here. So I'm gonna be using my canning funnel, which has a wide opening here. And I'm gonna use that, and because I've got these nice gloves on, I'm just going to fill my jars with my prepared beans. And these were a little on the large side. We were remarking when we were practicing earlier that they looked a whole lot like chunks of rhubarb. They're a little bit overripe, but they're going to be canned, and it doesn't matter to me if I have a particularly beany beans that I'm canning. They're going to soften and they're going to be delicious. Now, purple beans, you may or may not be aware, will not stay purple through the processing. They will, when they're exposed to heat, purple beans will turn green. So I'm going to just fill my jars here, several at a time. I don't need to work really fast. I don't have a hot product that I'm working with that I'm going to want to try to get jarred up one at a time and into the canner so I don't lose a lot of heat. This is all called a cold pack or a raw pack. And that is when you take room temperature ingredients that have not been pre-treated and you pack them right into cold jars, and you add to that a cold liquid, and then you put them into a cold canner. Cold packs or raw packs are typically recommended when you're making something in the pressure canner. Not always, it depends on what you're canning. But if you're canning raw vegetables, most always it's a cold pack. There is an option for a hot pack for beans and some other vegetables. I could have cooked these like a blanch for a couple of minutes and softened them up a little bit before I packed them into my jars. And if that was the case, I would want to probably use warm water or hot water to put on my beans instead of the cold tap water. I'm gonna make one more for the canner this time around. I figured if I'm going to try to get these jars processed in a timely manner for our class, I am not going to overstuff the canner with a full load of jars. I'll keep it at 4 and then process more at another time. Now you can stuff these beans right down in. They're going to soften a lot when they've been processed. They're under very high temperatures and very hot water boiling around, and they're going to get quite soft, and they're going to have a lot of extra space in the jar. So you can mush these in here quite a bit. You can pack them in pretty tightly. And then we're going to add some water. So if you were going to add salt, if you did want to have that extra flavoring in your jars, you would do that now. Now that we have our jars full, you would add the amount of salt per jar that you wish to have. Usually it's about 1/4 to 1/2 teaspoon per jar that people like to put in. There. Now I'm going to add some liquid. I'm going to add just plain water. Bring a little picture here, and I hope you can see that okay. I'm just adding a little bit of water. Now I'm going to be measuring what's called headspace in here, and I'll show you that in just a minute. But right now I'm just going to get my beans covered. You want to make sure that the food in the jar is completely covered with liquid. You want to make sure that everything is being processed in the same manner in that same jar. Okay. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use this nifty little tool called the Headspace measurer. And if you see this, and I'm not sure how well you can see it up against here, there's little steps on this little Headspace measuring tool, and they're divided up in increments of 1/4 inch. And that allows me to measure how much headspace I have. Now, I'll cover headspace more thoroughly in just a few minutes, but my recipe, according to the Ball Blue Book, asks me to leave 1 inch of headspace. So I'm going to go here, and these are admittedly very difficult to read. They're slightly embossed on the top there. And so I give you that. They are a difficult tool to read. But I'm going to put that 1 inch step on my jar. And I'm having that right inside here. And hopefully you can see that I don't want my food to come up above that 1 inch line. So I'm going to make sure that I have food and liquid that does not surpass that 1 inch line. And that's just about up to where the neck of the jar starts coming in close. And again, I'm measuring here, making sure that I have liquid in my jars, that all my food is covered. I have a couple extra beans here that have floated to the top, and I don't want those floating all around. Same here. And this guy seems to be a little extra, so we'll take him out as well. And it's okay to talk to your food. It appreciates it when you talk back. So I've measured my headspace, and now a really important step, especially when you have chunky food that you put into your jars, is to release any air bubbles that may be trapped because of the uneven spaces that you have in your jar. So you can use this headspace tool by flipping it around and using the other side, or you can use a plastic knife or a rubber spatula, or a skinny rubber spatula. Try not to use metal because that bangs up against the jar frequently enough and could cause a nick. So you're just going to run the side of this around the jars, and I can see some little bubbles freeing up, bubbling clear, letting those come out. We don't want those air pockets to exist in the jar, because they could cause a little bit of problem later on if we don't get them out. They could interfere with our proper headspace. And you can see, I can see in my jars now that my water has settled more. And so I have a few beans at the top of my jar that are no longer covered by liquid because they've been floated to the surface because my water has settled. So I'm going to add a couple drops more water to that jar. Again, just going around and getting all these bubbles out. So I have a really good product. When you're canning things that are more of a solid pack, they don't tend to have a lot of bubbles. So things like tomato sauce or jam, those types of things, they don't tend to have air bubbles because they're a solid pack in there, and all of their bubbles sort of flatten out and go away through the packing process. But something that's in here with all kinds of nooks and crannies, like an English muffin in there, does tend to settle a bit with all those air pockets. So like I said, I'm going to add just a wee bit more water to this jar here, and just a drop to this jar just to keep that up. And this one was just a little under as well. So now all of my jars are at the correct headspace that I've gotten there. And I do wish that they would stay these beautiful colors, because I think they would look beautiful on a shelf. But alas, in the heating process, those purple beans do turn green. So the next thing we want to do is apply our 2-piece lid. And I will get into the lids in great detail in just a short bit. But I'm going to make sure that my lids are in good shape, that there's no scratches or dents or anything that could interfere with a good seal. Oh, I do want to check. I'm glad I caught myself here. I want to check to make sure that my rims are dry, that there's nothing on there, any little pieces of bean, or if I'm doing any kind of like a salsa or a spaghetti sauce or something, I want to make sure that there's no little seeds or pieces of food on the rim of my jar that could interfere with my seal. So I'm just going to make sure that these are all nice and dry, and I know that there's nothing that could cause a failed seal. So then I'll take my clean lid. Again, I washed these, but I did not heat them, and that's another change that we'll cover in a bit. You no longer have to heat your canning lids. And then this is my screw band that I will slide on and start to tighten. But notice my fingertips are on this jar lid, and I'm only going to tighten as far as my fingertips will allow me to tighten. I'm not giving that extra hard turn to keep that lid on. All I want it to do is hold that flat dome lid in place. That's all its job is. So it doesn't have to be tight. So I have this one jar ready to go into my canner. I'm going to set that aside now while I cap up the rest of these jars. And you can always tell when you have new screw bands and new lids, because the screw bands twist on so effortlessly. They are so happy to be being used, and they're clean. There's no rust or anything preventing them from slipping on nicely. Okay, and the last jar. Again, just fingertip tight. In the canner behind me that I have here, I have filled this with a couple of quarts of water. The instructions tell me that I need to have 2 to 3 inches of water in my canner, which I have done. And we're going to cover the parts of the canner that I have a spare over here that we'll talk about in just a minute. But this canner is ready to have the jars put in. There is a rack in the bottom. I have 2 to 3 inches of water in there. And now I'm going to place my jars of beans in here. And they're ready to be canned. Now in the pressure canner, the jars can touch. They can go shoulder to shoulder right up in here. Usually this size canner, this is a 12-quart canner, will hold about 9 pint jars in the narrow neck variety. It'll hold, if I remember right, 7 of the wide mouth pint jars, maybe 8, but I know I can get 9 of the narrow necks in here. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put the cover on my pressure canner. I'm going to twist it into place. And then I'm not going to put the gauge on. I'm going to set that aside for just a moment. And I'm going to make sure there's nothing else that can melt in the way of my burner. That would always be a bad thing. And I'm going to turn on the heat. And this is going to start getting hot. And when that starts getting hot, it's going to start creating some steam in there because I'm not letting any steam out. And through this vent tube up here on the top that doesn't have the regulator on there yet, my gauge is not on there, usually it sits there. I'm gonna at one point notice a vent of steam, and that's when we're going to switch from what I'm talking to, and Sharon is going to flip the camera back over here so we can talk about what that vent of steam means and what to do about it. But at this point in time, we're just gonna let this heat, and we'll hear it making some boiling noises in there at some point. And then I'm gonna talk about some more of the equipment that is really important for the processing using a pressure canner. So bear with me because we will be jockeying back and forth between looking at equipment and going back to check on what's happening in the canner. Okay, and so before we cover all of the steps in the greater detail, like I just promised, let's check in with Sharon and make sure that up to this point, if anyone has any questions, we can answer those right now. Sharon, do we have any questions?
We do have one question from Heidi. She wants to know, is it still necessary to heat your jars before adding to either pressure canning or water bath canning before processing? And you may have answered that.
Okay, that's a good question because that could be easily confused with the sterilization piece. Now, I just mentioned talking about a cold pack of food. And when you're talking about cold pack, you've got a raw, product, cold raw product going into a cold jar that's going into a cold canner. And that's important to remember and to help guide you about whether or not you need to preheat your jars, because we're all about reducing the stress on our jars. We don't want our jars to have to go through wild fluctuations while we're trying to get them filled and into the canner. We want to try to keep that as even tempered as possible. So when we're talking about a raw pack, a cold pack, and we're going from cold food to cold jar to even cold water into a cold canner, there is no need to warm your jars up first because all the food going in and the canner itself is already cold. That is not the same situation when we're talking about a boiling water bath canner. And if anyone tuned in to my previous webinar that we did last month, we talked a lot about the boiling water bath canner, and that's a canner full of boiling hot water. And usually you have cooked a product that's going into that boiling water bath canner. Those are all of those jams and those jellies. Those are the chutneys, the relishes, the pickles, those types of things, salsa that's usually cooked. We're starting with a hot thing that we've cooked, and we're needing to put it into a hot jar. So we need to warm that jar up first. And that warm jar with the warm contents is going into a boiling water bath and being submerged into that boiling water. So that's a time when you would want to warm your jars ahead of time. Warming them is not necessarily the same as sterilizing. You can keep your jars warm for a period of time, for 10 minutes, 5 minutes. You don't have to bring them to a boil for 10 minutes like sterilizing is. You can just heat them up and keep them warm on a simmer burner in the back. They don't have to have boiled for 10 minutes first. So Heidi, I hope that answers your question.
We do have one more question, Lisa.
Yes.
From Daryl, according to Ball, the temperature difference should not exceed 80 degrees Fahrenheit between the jar and the water or the food and the jar.
Correct. And so you don't want to have huge differences in temperature. So when we're starting with a cold pack, there's nothing in here that's a heat difference. So we're starting with cold product with cold jars, cold water into a cold canner. But with that boiling water bath, because that boiling water is 212 degrees, we want to make sure that we have hot product. And usually when we're making jam or a spaghetti sauce or an applesauce, we're cooking that and boiling that down for a period of time on the stove. And then we're taking that hot product and immediately filling our jars. So that's when you want to make sure that you have hot product, hot jars, hot water, so the temperature is consistent. You don't want wild fluctuations in temperature. That will just, be a recipe for putting too much stress on your jars at once in too rapid a time frame, and they could break. Thanks, Daryl. That was great.
He also says ball jars are annealed, ANNEALED, a process that limits stress in the glass in the manufacturing process. This is not the same as tempering, which introduces stress to the glass for extreme temperature differences.
Well, that I don't know about. And I was going to be talking in a little bit about tempered glass, but I don't know about the annealed piece. So Daryl, thank you for bringing that up, and I will have to look into that and verse myself a little better on that. But when we talk about jars, we will definitely talk about why we use only canning jars and why we don't use other types of jars. Any other questions right now?
Yeah,
That was a good one.
Heidi states fantastic. That definitely answers her question. And she's very thankful for this webinar.
Wonderful. Glad you could join us tonight, Heidi. Okay. So I'm going to jump back on now, and while we're waiting for our canner to do our thing, and I can hear the water in there is starting to boil. And I don't see any steam coming out the vent tube yet, but that's going to be coming shortly. And like I said, when I notice that there's a steam vent tube, a stream of steam coming from the vent tube, then I will break away and bring us over there. So while I was filling the jars with beans, I did mention, and I talked a bit about that headspace, and we measured that headspace. So I do have a graphic that will show you that headspace is that pocket of air that's right in between the top of your product, and here it just happens to be beans, and the top of the jar, okay? And so that's what the headspace is, that little pocket of air. So in general, not always, but a good rule of thumb is 1/4 inch is given for jams and jellies, about 1/2 inch for fruits, tomatoes, and pickles, and 1 to 1.5 inches of headspace for pressure canned items like meats and vegetables. That's because under all of that high temperature, now we know what boiling water looks like, and we know when we've boiled things on the stovetop, they tend to move around, they sputter and splatter, and there's movement in that pot, and that's at 212 degrees. So what we've got going on in our pressure canner is between 240 and 250 degrees. So you can only imagine the extreme movement that some of these foods are going to be going through. So you want to always make sure that when you're pressure canning, you have left ample headspace in there. So make sure that you use tested recipes, and we're going to cover that in a little bit as well. Too much headspace, if you decided that you only had 1/2 jar of food that you were canning, you didn't have a full jar's worth, but you wanted to can that anyway. If you leave too much headspace in your jar, that could definitely result in a weak seal. And that vacuum seal is what's really important in keeping microorganisms out. Too little headspace, if you filled your jars up way too high, just trying to use up that last little bit of food that was in the pot. You didn't want to have a couple spoonfuls left over, so you just topped off all of your jars and you brought the headspace up a little bit too high. Too little headspace may force food up under the lid, which may cause a failed seal. Or in the case of pressure canning, remember that food in there is really kind of violently banging around inside that jar. It could actually, with too little headspace, bang up onto that lid and dent the lid upward. And then you won't get a seal either, and you will have destroyed the lid. So headspace definitely matters when it comes to making a safe, shelf-stable product. Another thing that matters is altitude. And I know that tonight we have some people from the state of Maine joining us, but we have a number of people who do not live in the state of Maine. So you need to make sure that you make adjustments for higher altitudes depending on where you live. And higher altitudes are defined as 1,000 feet or more above sea level. Now, this is important because water boils at lower temperatures as altitude increases. So lowering boiling temperatures are less effective for killing bacteria. So increasing your processing time or your canner pressure will compensate for lower boiling temperatures. If you live in Maine and you don't necessarily know your altitude, we are going to include in the resources that we mail to you a handy elevation by county resource so you can figure out what your elevation is and what adjustments you need to make. If you do not live in the state of Maine, you're wondering whether or not you need to be making altitude adjustments, I would recommend you check in with your county cooperative extension in the state in which you live. So now we've got another part of equipment that we want to talk about. So I've talked about some asides, but another piece of equipment that we want to talk about is using a research-based resource for your recipes and instructions. So here's a picture that shows which resources the cooperative extension uses exclusively. Our own research here in the state of Maine has indicated that there is a prevalence of inaccurate and misleading information that's on the internet with regard to canning instructions and recipes. So it's really important to follow a research-based recipe. And right now, you cannot see it unless I were to pick the camera up. And I'm gonna, Sharon, let's experiment. If you switch cameras with me, I don't know if this is gonna work or not. We're gonna see. I'm bringing you over here to my canner. And figure out here. I've got some stuff happening here. I've got some moisture, some liquid coming out of my overpressure plug. So when that overpressure plug pops up, that's going to lock in, that's not, excuse me, not the overpressure plug, the lid lock, there it goes. When the lid lock pops up, that means it's clamped onto the lid on the inside, so that lid cannot come off now unless the pressure is out of the pot. So it's telling me I've got enough pressure in there to lock my lid. What I also see going on, and this is perfectly fine, this is my overpressure plug. And I do have some seepage coming out of there, and that's perfectly fine. That's a normal thing. So if you're new to pressure canning and your rubber overpressure plug starts to leak liquid and it's really making you nervous, rest assured, that's okay. And now I'm not sure if you can see, I'm going to try to get my camera angled in here. There you go. You can start to see that coming out of that tube, I've got some puffs of steam that are coming out. So I'm going to keep my eye on that, and I'm going to wait until I have a steady stream, a steady, like just a plume that's just straight. It doesn't sputter, it doesn't falter, and I'm going to let that stream for 10 minutes. Okay, and that's called venting the canner. And it's really important to vent the canner because we want to make sure that we exhaust all the excess air that's inside that canner so that we can start building pressure. So we're going to force that extra air out while we build up a nice head of steam in there and start building up our pressure. So we're going to let that go for 10 minutes. And I'm going to try to pay attention to my clock here so that I can, at 10 minutes, put my canner gauge on. So we're going to keep talking. We're going to forge on. So the resources, again, that we use with a cooperative extension, the first one that we rely on is the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning. Down here in the picture, that's the very first picture on the left with the colored circles in the middle. That is a USDA publication that is incredibly updated, that is put out every few years with most current information, and that is what home canners and industry alike tend to use. Personally, It's not the most user-friendly resource. I'm a little bit of a stickler on certain aspects of resources I use. And one of the most important things to me is that a resource have an index. And this particular resource, the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning, does not have an index. That's a tiny pet peeve. The next one that we want to talk about is going to be the third picture over on the right. And that is called the So Easy to Preserve book. This does have an index. It's the one that I personally will pull off my shelf most frequently when I get calls into my office about canning. That is put out by the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension and is available if you contacted the University of Georgia or any cooperative extension, we can order that for you. It's not available from a retail point of view. You can't go into a store and buy that. And that's the same thing with the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning. You're not going to go into your local hardware store and find a copy hanging on the shelf. We also make great use of the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And that's an online resource, and it's a very, very user-friendly tool. It has search criteria. It has all kinds of preservation information broken down, whether it's water bath canning, pressure canner, dehydrating, fermenting, freezing, all kinds of information and current issues that are being debated on the national scene about current guidance and best practices. Very, very useful site. And finally, the Ball Blue book is another resource that we use a lot. And that one has a lot of name recognition for people. It's something that you can go to your hardware store. You can often go to your grocery store. You can go to a big box store, and you can typically find the Ball Blue book. It's updated every couple of years and contains information on the most frequently canned products across the US. If you could see these resources side by side, which I don't have mine with me right now, but the Ball Blue book is a fairly thin, it's almost like a thick magazine, whereas something like the So Easy to Preserve is a fairly thick cookbook and just has a whole lot more information that people across the whole country might be using, including real arcane types of things that not a whole lot of people are canning. I've got an excellent, I don't know if you can hear all the noise going on here, but I've got a great lot of noise going on behind me and a lot of sputtering. So I know that in a couple of more minutes, I'm going to be able to put my pressure gauge on the canner and we can start timing very shortly. And then we also have some great publications through the University of Maine Cooperative Extension. And you can get on our website, you can get on our Facebook page, and you can search for canning publications on our website. And you're going to have a great variety of different foods that you can search for that you will be able to find and download for free. So those are all great resources, and any one of them has been tested, and we can feel comfortable recommending use of these products to you and use of the information and recipes in them. Again, we know that from our own research that the vast majority of recipes that you can find online are lacking critical steps to best practices in safe home food preservation, or they contain completely misleading and just outright wrong and unsafe information. So always look at the website that you're using, and if it helps, search for something that ends with a .edu. And that lets you know that an educational institution is behind that publication, that site that you're looking at, and you can bet that there's going to be some research that's gone on and that's a safe resource for you to use. Be wary of your great aunt or your grandmother or your sister's friend's cousin's neighbor that lives down the road that's going to give you all kinds of great advice. Take it with a grain of salt and remember the things you're learning in this class tonight, because these are the very best, safest practices that we would like to promote and make sure that you are following to have safe home preserved food in your home. Okay. So I think we've got about 4 more minutes on here. So we're going to start to talk about the kinds of jars. Well, actually, yeah, let's talk about the kinds of jars. So as Daryl mentioned previously, and I don't know anything about annealed jars, but I will look into that. But we do have some recommendations around canning jars, do's and don'ts. So here in this picture of the canning jars we do recommend. These are actual canning jars. They're manufactured as canning jars, and they're meant to withstand years and years and years of temperature changes. The glass is tempered. It's intended to be in freezing temperatures, so 0 or below, all the way up to 240 degrees. That's a pretty wide range of temperatures that these products can go through without breakage. These are also jars that come in a variety of sizes. And in this photo, you'll see in the forefront, there's a 1/4 pint. To the right of that is a pint, is a 1/2 pint. In the back in the center is a 3/4 pint. And generally speaking, you'll see jams, jellies, chutneys, you'll see conserves, salsas, those types of things, homemade ketchup or sauces going in this size jar. In the back to the left and the right are standard pint-sized jars. And there's a small mouth, a regular mouth on the left and a wide mouth on the right. They are both the very same capacity, except the opening is a little bit different. And some people prefer the wide mouth, and others don't have a preference. They use the smaller mouth, the regular size mouth. There's a price difference when you're looking at wide mouth versus regular mouth. The wide mouth is always going to cost a little bit more. Not only the jars, but also the lids that go with those jars will be a little bit more. Not drastic, but there is a markup on the wider mouth jars. These jars, as well as their quart-sized counterparts, are all acceptable sized jars. When you're talking about jar sizes, I do have to say that you have to look at the kind of canner that you have and before choosing to buy or can in larger size jars. There is a canner that's much larger. Here it's a double decker where you can actually put a layer of jars on the bottom layer on one rack, layer another rack on top, and add another full layer of jars. So if you're someone who cans a lot, that's terrific. You have double the capacity to get a lot of your canning done in one go. Ball does market extra large 1/2 gallon, I believe they're jars. Those are not recommended for canning anything but juice. So you want to be careful. Don't go out and buy this product because you think you're going to be able to can beef stew or anything like that in there. You want to make sure that you are only buying the size jars that you can actually use and will fit in your canner. So that's a caveat there. When we talk about jars you don't want to use, we have a lineup of those too. First and foremost on the list are the old glass jars with the wider bales and the glass dome lids. Those at one time were the gold standard, but are now no longer considered the best use. Those jars had a couple of issues. In between the jar rim and the lid, that glass dome lid, there would be a removable rubber gasket. And the job of that gasket was to seal not only on the bottom, but also on the top. So you had 2 chances for failure of a seal. And then you have the pressure of the wire bale smashing down on that dome lid to mash that into the seal to prevent that air lock, to keep air out. And the pressure of that wire bale on that glass dome lid often resulted in broken dome lids. So we don't recommend this type of jar anymore. Similar to that, on the right-hand side, you'll see this cute little jar with a hinge type of a wire bail on it. And again, that's not a canning jar. That is a decorative use only jar, not intended for canning. And it looks great with your colored rice or your lentils or your split peas, but please don't use that for canning. And then we have a couple other jars. The one in the back has that old-fashioned zinc lid. We no longer recommend zinc lids. And the jar in the front is not a canning jar. It is a decorative spice jar. Ball started putting some of these out as spice jars, not intended for canning, but people are getting them very confused with that little quarter pint jar that was in the previous slide, thinking they're interchangeable, and they're not. So we're going to stop right now on jars. We're going to cover lids in a minute, but we now have a super good head of steam coming out here. It's been venting now for 10 minutes, and I'm going to put my gauge on. Now, according to the recipe in the Ball Blue book that I'm using tonight, my recipe states that I want to process my green beans in pint-sized jars using a weighted gauge, that's the type I have tonight, at 10 pounds of pressure for 20 minutes. So this particular gauge that I had in my hand, this is one style of a weighted gauge. This is the base, and it comes with 2 additional rings. Okay, this is 5 pounds on its own. If I add another ring, I add another 5 pounds to bring me to a total of 10. And if I add that third ring, I now have a 15-pound pressure gauge in my hand. But I only need 10 pounds for my green beans. So I'm going to remove one, and these are magnetic, they stick together. And I'm going to now cap off that vent of steam. This is the part that if you're a new canner, is going to send you over the edge because it seems really scary. That's a really hot tube of steam coming out there. That could be a really bad burn if I don't do this correctly. So I'm going to show you how to do it correctly. It's not a difficult process once you get over this step. So you're just going to walk up and you're just going to tap it, just like that. Now, if you're home, if you were in a class that I was teaching, I would make you take it off and put it on a couple times, just to get familiar with it. Remember, you're in charge, not the canner. So you're just going to go up there and cap that up. Okay? So it's a lot quieter in here all of a sudden. You'll notice that. I think you can hear the difference in the sound in this room. So now that I've exhausted all of the excess air that's in that canner, already my gauge is starting to rock. I'm going to move my camera over here again. So Sharon, bear with me. We're switching things up here. All right. So I hope you can hear, and I hope you can see what's going on there. You see that gauge is rocking? So the gauge is going to talk to you. And what that gauge is telling you is that it's trying to let off steam. So what you want to go for is a nice balance between a moving gauge and a quiet gauge. A gauge that's letting off steam and a gauge that's building steam. So you're going to adjust your heat until you get that regulator to calm down to a nice gentle rhythm. Now, I can start timing as soon as I'm at pressure. And I know I'm at my 10 pounds because I'm rocking. So that lets me know that if it's trying to let off steam, it's at pressure or above. And I need to start knocking the heat down to get it to gently rock. So when you're working with a gas stove, it's really easy to adjust that heat very quickly to where you need it to be. When you're working with an electric range, the first time that you do this, it's going to take some give and take for you to figure out where the sweet spot is on your temperature dial, okay, on your dial for your level of heat. With their gas stove, I've already brought this down. It's much quieter. It's rocking much more gently than it was, but I want it to have some quiet time. So I'm going to keep knocking my heat down little bits at a time. Now, a lot of canning books will tell you that it should only jiggle 3 times each minute. Well, I find that that's really difficult to get to. Again, your gauge is talking to you. As long as you have a rhythm of building a little bit of pressure, letting a little pressure off, building a little pressure, letting a little pressure off. When it's building pressure, it's quiet. When it's letting pressure out, it's jiggling. That's that steam escaping out of that vent tube, making that rock and making that noise. So that's what you're shooting for, is a quiet rhythm between the two. Then you know you're holding the line pretty steady at 10 pounds of pressure. Now, if you have a dial gauge, which is a different kind of gauge, does the exact same thing, but it just looks different, then you're going to be watching for a needle to be hovering at. Usually when we have a weighted gauge at 10 pounds pressure, the dial gauge is calling for 11 pounds of pressure. So you'll be watching that little needle hover around the 11-pound range, but it can go up or down 2 and still be in range. So we're now much quieter. I don't know if you can see really well on the big camera coming in here, but we're still rocking steadily. So I'm going to knock the heat down even just another minute more. And I started at, knocked my heat out altogether. So I guess I can't go too low on this big gas stove. That's another thing working in Sodexo's kitchen. Their equipment's really big, and my equipment at home is really little. So I'm timing for 20 minutes, and that was about 5 minutes ago. So I've got 15 minutes more to go before we're going to turn this off. So I'm just going to keep my ear listening. Now, if any of you have had a horror story in your past where you've heard someone talk about a blowing up canner, or they talk about, jars broken everywhere and they're really afraid of the pressure canner, that's because they were not canning right. They weren't canning correctly. Canning is an active and engaged process. When you have a canner going, you don't leave the room. You don't walk away. You don't go hang clothes out on the line. You don't go give the kids a bath. You don't go out and milk the cow. You stay local and present in the kitchen, and you stay paying attention to what's going on here. If you find out the backstory to the horror stories that you've heard of blowing up pressure canners, you'll find that almost every single case was either improper equipment, like the wrong lid was attached to a canner. When they had 2 canners, they mixed up the canners and the covers, and things went terribly wrong. Or someone was inattentive. And that's the most common reason why canners would blow up, is because they would get turned on, and then it usually fell to the woman of the household to do the canning. She would be busy doing 1,000 other things in any given day, and she'd walk out of the kitchen. And when she came back, it was because there was an explosion in the kitchen. And since those days, pressure canners have incorporated more safety features, and we're trying to do our part to teach people to be present and engaged in the canning process. So that's what we're doing tonight. We're not leaving our space. We're staying right handy, paying attention to the time. Okay, so we left off, we were going to talk quickly about lids. And what we do recommend here, I'm going to switch cameras, I think. We're going to go back so you can see my little hands down here, hopefully. And what we've got here is we've got the 2-piece lid that we do recommend. Now, a few years ago, there were big concerns about the BPA that was in a lot of plastics that people were using for food storage and food and beverage consumption. And Ball has now created Bpa Free Lids. And I do believe if you buy other lids than the Ball brand, you can also find them as BPA free. It will say so on the label. So this is the plastic on the inside here, that covering of the metal, that's the BPA free part. And that does come in direct contact with the food in the jars. So it is really great because that is now a BPA free option. Around the rim of this lid, you're going to see that red ring, and that's the gasket or the sealing compound that's going to actually get sticky and tacky when it's hot, and it's going to form a stickiness that's going to stick to the rim of the jar. And that's going to be great because we want that lid to stay in place. So that's going to be stuck right on there. What holds that in place until it becomes sticky and tacky and sticks in place is that screw band that we put on. And the screw band will click on, and again, it's not going on tight. It's just fingertip tight, and that's just holding that in place. After the processing has finished and your jars have sealed and you're ready to store them, we do recommend that you remove the screw band entirely. Wash it, dry it thoroughly because they're very susceptible to rusting, and store in a nice, cool, dry place where it won't get rusty or dirty, and wait for the next time that you're going to can to pull that out again. These jars can be put into storage with just the lid, which is going to have a vacuum seal, and it's going to be adhering to the rim of that jar because of that tacky sealing compound. So newer lids that you see today will have a button in the middle. You can almost visually see the button. A sealed jar will not do this. Hear that? So we don't want that kind of sound going on. When there's a vacuum seal in there, you'll see that little button in the middle is dented down. So that indicates visually that that's a good vacuum seal. This jar is ready to be washed, labeled, and stored. Lids, screw bands can be used over and over and over and over as long as they remain in good condition. Lids are only intended for one-time use as canning. If you're going to ask it to seal, only once. And the reason why is if you have a microscope and if this jar was fully sealed and we pried it open, you would hear the release of the vacuum seal. It would go when you popped it open, and you would open that jar up. And if you had a microscope on hand at that very moment and you looked at the rim of this jar, you would see tiny little red fragments of that sealing compound stuck to the rim of that jar. And if you use that same microscope and you looked here on the sealing compound, you would see little teeny tiny pock marks where that sealing compound has now been compromised because it's stuck to this jar. So that's no longer a fully effective lid that you can rely on to seal for you another time. It's been compromised. Do not ask it to seal food for you again. You can keep it on hand if you've got leftovers and you regularly use jars for leftovers and you want to keep that, or I'm always making iced tea or lemonade or other kinds of beverages in canning jars and sticking in the fridge, and I'm always pulling out used lids. Go ahead and use those. I do a lot of freezing in my canning jars, and because I do a lot of freezing in the canning jars, I can take any number of used lids and use those for freezing because I'm not asking it to seal. I'm just asking it to cover the jar and protect the contents from the cold, frigid air of the freezer. You can purchase the lids by themselves in little containers like this, either regular mouth or wide mouth. Or if you need to replace the screw bands and all, then you can buy the entire kit of screw bands and lids in one package. And that's great, especially if you're giving gifts away, jars of jam or chutneys or whatever that you've made, and you're giving away a lot of your lids, then you definitely will need to be replacing those lids and screw bands. And if you are storing your jars, this is just a little reminder, if you are storing your jars, especially jams and jellies and things that make such great gifts, and you're ready to give that as a gift to someone, don't forget to pull out the screw band, because once they open that up and they have no screw band, then they have no way of keeping their jar lid on. And so always remember to tuck a screw in with that bit. Okay, and we have 5 more minutes to go on our canning processing time, and doing pretty well over there. We're doing pretty well. So the next thing that we want to talk about, oh, and you can get jars, lids, and replacement lids usually anywhere that you can buy canning jars, like a grocery store, a hardware store, many of the big box stores that will have these. Here in Maine, we have an Amish store down in Smyrna in southern Usda County, and they also have canning jars as well. I have used the Walmart brand canning jars. You'll notice when it's Ball or Kerr or American Harvest, they usually have their emblem emblazoned or embossed on the front, and somewhere they'll say Ball or Kerr or whatever company is selling them. The Walmart jars are a little shockingly plain. There's nothing, they're just smooth glass jars. So I was quite skeptical as to whether or not these were going to be successful jars or if they were going to be more susceptible to breakage. And so far I've used them quite a few times and they have not failed yet. So go ahead and feel free to purchase those products with pretty good confidence that they're going to perform well for you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about other gadgets that are fun to use. So earlier you saw me use the jar funnel. And this, I swore for years I didn't need one because I would just, as you saw me do tonight, grab handfuls of my beans or products, and I would stuff those into jars, and half the time, you know, I'd hit the jar or miss the jar. And then when I found that I used the canning funnel, boy, 100% of everything went right into the jar. I didn't have any spilling. And it was much easier to ladle hot jams and jellies and applesauce and things into jars. I didn't have all kinds of running stuff going down my jars that I had to try to clean up. So I can be stubborn sometimes, and I thought it, but boy, was I stupid. And it's a wonderful tool. And if you haven't got one of these in your repertoire of tools, it's pretty inexpensive. I would definitely invest in one because it has made my life much easier. And then something that we used earlier was the Headspace measuring tool. And again, especially if you're a new canner, these are quite good to use because it lets you know exactly how much headspace to put in a jar. And those are the measurements there. Now, from a design point of view, this is kind of difficult to read because I don't know if you can see it clearly, but they're not well marked. And if you have any kind of vision problems, those demarcation numbers, the steps are easy to see, but it's really difficult to see what each one of those steps is unless you know. So that's the only fault I would give that, is that it's a visually poor tool to have to use. I have a jar lifter that's here, and the part that goes around the jar is the silicone wrapped end here. I've seen a lot of people tell me how much trouble they have using their jar lifter. It just doesn't seem to work really well, and they got it upside down. And it has to be said that I've seen it in almost every single class I've ever taught that has happened. So it's a common mistake. So it's the rubber side that goes up against the jars, that non-slip grip. I didn't need to use this jar lifter to put the jars into the canner because they were cold. But when I take them out, you bet yourself that I will be using this because those jars are hot. And if you've ever used pot holders or dishcloths to take out wet items from a hot environment, you know that those get wet really quickly, and heat conducts really well through water, and you end up with a burn anyway. So these are a wonderful little tool to have. And lastly, these tongs are great if you do need to sterilize your jars, or if you're keeping your jars pretty warm because you are going to be doing that water bath canning we talked about, that question that Heidi had. And you want to get your jars out of that hot or boiling liquid, then this is great to just grab your jars out of that hot water, dump the water out and then be able to fill that jar without having to hold on to that hot jar or fish it out of the hot water. So again, very handy to use that. I will say, I have other tongs at home that have the same silicone gripping on them, and I far prefer that. And I say they're at home, I lost them. I have no idea what I did with them. But they were wonderful, and as soon as I can find another pair of silicone coated tongs, I will be using them because they're just so much better at gripping the jar and feeling like you're not going to let that slip away. So those are some terrific tools that you're going to use and that you will have access to. And I think right now, I'm going to turn off my canner. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn the heat off, and that's going to just come down now in pressure. And I'll know, and Sharon, we're going to go back on the camera for a second. I know you love it when I pop around like this all the time. We're going to come over here for a second. And I mentioned this plug right over here, and that's that lid lock. And as long as that lid lock has risen, that means it's clamped onto the lid from the this lid is clamped onto the pot from the inside. And I cannot get this cover off until that drops down. When that drops down, I'll know that all the pressure is out of the pot and it's safe to go ahead and open the pot. So until that happens, you're stuck talking with me for a little bit longer. How's that? Okay. And I think, even though it's not listed for right now, Sharon, I think I do want to ask if there are any questions at this point before I go on, because it feels like I've talked a whole lot and given a whole lot of information. And I'd like to have a chance to check in with everyone to see if everyone's doing okay.
We do have a question from Heidi. Can you provide examples of what you might freeze in your jars?
Oh, sure. So at one point I was a family of 5 and didn't have electricity. And so everything that I preserved had to be pressure canned on my gas stove. And when you have 3 young boys growing up with you and a hardworking homesteading husband, you go through a lot of food. And so I would can probably 350, or more jars of food a year, usually in quart jars because we were a growing family. I didn't have the option of plugging in a dehydrator for hours at a time because I didn't have electricity or a generator or a solar panel or anything. And I didn't have a freezer. I had a small little freezer on top of my propane run refrigerator. And so the options to me were limited, but I had all these great jars. Well, now all of my 3 sons have grown up, moved away. It's just my husband and me living at home. And we find that we don't can a lot of vegetables anymore. We prefer frozen vegetables over canned for the most part. There are still a few things that we like canned. So we have transitioned everything we used to can into frozen. So all of our peas, all of our beans, all of our carrots are frozen now. We use the same jars. We don't fill them up as high, but again, and that's a great thing. If there's anybody out there that's willing to trade quart jars for pint jars, I'm totally into that because I don't need these big quart jars anymore. My husband and I barely go through a pint jar in 2 meals. So, hey, I'll spread the word. Anybody want to trade? I'm game. I've got quarts if you've got pints. So that's a few examples there, but we also freeze stock. If I make turkey or if I make a chicken or roast beef and I cook down the bones from the beef or the chicken carcass or the turkey carcass and I make a nice stock, I'll strain that and I will freeze that also in quart jars. A lot of different things that we put in jars. Broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, those types of all the vegetables that we freeze, we'll put in jars. I can't see spending the money on plastic zip bags when I have jars. Got lots and lots and lots of jars. So does that answer your question, Heidi, or did you have a follow-up?
She hasn't responded yet, but Daryl did state that RSVP makes a wide mouth funnel specifically sized for wide mouth jars. Better for half peaches or whole can peaches. The wider bottom end of the funnel fits wide mouth jars snugly and does not slip and slide.
Okay, and this funnel here does fit wide mouth, but you can see it's more formulated. Whoops, I'm on this camera. You can see it's more formulated to that narrow end. And I don't have a wide mouth jar with me tonight, but this fits perfectly into the narrow. And it does fit into the wide, but you can see that there's going to be some space where that does slip and slide. So Daryl, that's great to know. And again, you said that was through RSVP?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll have to check that out. Daryl, you sound like you've got quite a bit of canning knowledge under your belt. I'm glad that you're with us tonight.
Heidi said that that's very good and thank you. And she also wanted to know, can you speak to the ability to have a pressure canner tested at the Cooperative Extension Service?
Oh my goodness. Do you know what my very next slide is that we're going to talk about, Heidi? Testing your pressure gauge. It's like you have ESP. So if there's no more questions, and I'll double check, Sharon, are there any more questions?
No, there are no other questions at this time.
Okay, so if there are no other questions, we will jump right into that. And just to let you know that I mentioned that there were two types of canners. These that I have here tonight are both what's called weighted gauge canners. Excuse me for just a minute. And there are two different kinds of weighted gauge canners. I showed you the first one that had the magnetic pieces that you could take on and off. What we've also got, and I don't know which camera I'm on, what we've also got here is, I'll show you just real quickly. This is an older type of gauge and a weighted gauge. And I have several of these at home because I have several different pressure canners and pressure cookers. One that was my grandmother's. And this has the 5 pounds, the 10 pounds, and the 15-pound option. And what you would do is you would just whatever your recipe calls for, like tonight, here's the vent tube on this lid. And our recipe called for 10 pounds of pressure. You would find the 10 pounds of pressure and you would just put that right on the vent tube right there. And when I was growing up, now this pressure gauge tonight, when it was rattling, was actually pretty tame. This one was very raucous. It would get jiggling. And it could actually make your head just rattle. If you were pressure canning for a long time, I could go to bed and just hear it all night long in my head. It would be ringing because it makes such a racket when it is jiggling. Those are both weighted gauges. Weighted gauges are created at the manufacturer. They're pre-weighted. Unless they've gone through a flood or a fire, they really don't need to be replaced. They don't need to be tested because they're already pre-weighted. There's nothing to test. What you do want to test is the dial gauge canner. I mentioned a little earlier that it has like a needle that you're going to want to monitor on the scale of 5 to 20 pounds of pressure. And we had just had a picture up that Sharon, and I interrupted you. Sharon was so good. She had it up and everything. And that's going to be this unit here. So this is what our test unit looks like. And we do recommend, and it is recommended by the USDA, to have your dial gauge tested every year. Dial gauges are a lot more finicky than the weighted gauges, and they do get a little temperamental if they get jostled around in a drawer, for instance, if they're in with your silverware or whatever. They get a little temperamental if they get banged around on the countertop, or if they get dropped, or if they get introduced to some water or steam. The high temperatures, if they got left outside and it was freezing, they may not like that. And so they do need to be tested every year because they're just a little more finicky. So this is our tester unit with someone's gauge on it. Our master gauge gets sent into Presto every year for calibration, and that's the gauge that you see in the far back mounted onto that brass fitting. And the gauge we're testing is the one that's toward the front. And when we pump this up and we apply 5 pounds of pressure into this unit, and our master gauge is reading 5 pounds of pressure, we're looking to see that your gauge is calibrated right along with that 5 pounds of pressure. And then we will test for 10 pounds of pressure to make sure that your gauge is reading true at 10 pounds and again at 15. And what we will tell you is that if your gauge if it's on, we will label the back of your gauge with the date that it was tested, the initials of who provided that test for you, and what the readings are at 5, 10, and 15, those critical points. If your gauge is off, it can be off consistently by up to 2 pounds. So what I mean by that is, if you are 2 pounds off at the 5 pound mark, you're 2 pounds off at the 10 pound mark, and you're 2 pounds off at the 15 pound mark, that's consistent. You have a consistent reading, and we'll say, great, here are the adjustments you need to make, but you're okay. Keep using your gauge, it's fine. So you have a 1 to 2 pound leeway that you can have your gauge not quite sync up to the master gauge. If, however, you're more than 2 pounds off, or if you're inconsistent, so you might read 5 pounds when the master gauge says 5, but then at the 10 pound mark, your gauge is only saying 7 pounds, and at the 15 pound mark, your gauge is only saying 11 pounds, well, then that's a huge variation that you've got going on. We're going to, first we're going to test it again to make sure that what we found is indeed true. So we'll test it a couple of times. And if it's still reading kind of wonky and all over the place, we will recommend that you replace that gauge. So that is a free service to anyone that wants to contact us and set up a date and time. We do recommend every year, and certainly the best time for you to bring your gauge in is before you need to use your gauge. So usually the winter months are when people find that they're most likely to bring their gauge in because they don't need it quite yet. We have people that are contacting us now that need their gauge tested, but they need it tested that day because they need to use it the next day. And they're worried that it's not calibrated. That's really difficult. We're spread around this huge state, and it's hard for us to necessarily get to all of our testing sites. So in the state of Maine, I believe we're going to make sure that you have our website to the University of Maine Cooperative Extension. Contact the county county office that's closest to you to find out how to get your dial gauge tested for free. If you live outside the state of Maine, you're going to want to contact your local county cooperative extension in your state, and they will provide the same service for you as well. So that's something that we're pretty committed to, making sure that the general public has access to good information on how to can properly, and then the backup and support to help make that happen. So this is a free service that we provide to you to help encourage you to get your gauge tested. So Heidi, thanks for asking that question. You were right on time. Another question that we frequently field here at the Cooperative Extension is around canning on glass top stoves. And so there are some potential concerns for canning on glass top stoves, namely that the heat from the large canning pot can damage your stove by causing the glass to crack or discolor around the burner, or even burn out the element to the burner. So if you have a flat glass top stove and you do want to can, the very first thing you want to do is check to see if your model is safe to can on. Call the manufacturer or check out the appliance on the website. Usually there'll be a serial model that you can access to make sure that you've got the right information for your particular flat top stove, glass top stove. If you are cleared by the manufacturer to can on your glass top stove, be sure to find a boiling water bath canner or a pressure canner that has a flat bottom. Now, the pressure canner is not such an issue. As you can see on the picture in the right, most pressure canners, I think all pressure canners, are made of stainless steel and the bottoms are flat. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen a pressure canner with a grooved bottom. So that shouldn't be a big issue. The issue for canning on glass top stoves comes with the boiling water bath canner. And as you can see in this photo on the left, that's one of the typical granny ware, enamel ware types of canners that are very popular, but you can see the bottom is grooved. Now that's going to work well on an electric coil type stove or on the grates of a gas stove, because you're still going to get heat penetrating and circulating all around the bottom of that pot. The problem would come if you were on a flat top, then you have areas of the pot that are not in direct contact with the heat source. And that's going to prevent an even distribution of heat inside that pot. So you want to look for a boiling water bath canner, similar to the one on the right, also made of stainless steel, that is a flat top, flat bottom, that will have full 100% contact with the glass top surface in question. You also want to make sure that you find the canning pot that is not larger than the diameter of your burner, and that will help prevent that damage to the top of the stove. If you cannot can on your glass top stove, you can always try to buddy up with a friend or a family member and do a canning at someone else's house. You could purchase an induction burner for canning, and there are a couple that I can see in eye shot of this kitchen here in Sodexo, and you could do that. Or a lot of people have reported that they use the gas burner that's part of their outdoor gas grill, and they have great success using that. My only caution there is make sure you're not on a drafty, windy day, because that's going to mess around with good heat penetration, excuse me, and good pressure build if you're using a pressure canner. And you want to make sure when you take your jars out of the canner that there's no drafts, no wind. You want to get those inside to remove them from the canner where it's a more neutral airflow. So we talked about the kinds of regulators that are on there. And here's a better picture of a weighted gauge like the one we're using tonight, and that dial gauge. Electric pressure cookers is something we do need to talk about. And electric pressure cookers are all the rage now, and everybody's using them. I teach classes on them. In fact, I'm teaching one next month. They are very popular. However, electric pressure cookers are not to be used for canning. Now, this becomes a problem when the product is labeled and marketed as good for canning. In fact, after the big rage of all kinds of electric pressure cookers flooding the market, that's when a lot of our cooperative extensions and our research-based institutions started really studying, are these as effective and safe for canning foods as the good old-fashioned pressure cookers and water bath canners? And what was discovered and what was replicated in study after study after study is that the temperature required, so we always have a certain temperature we need to hit for a period of time that we need to process for. What was found in all of these studies over and over again was that the key temperature point was achieved, but it wasn't maintained throughout the entire processing time. So we ended up with fluctuations in, we had the peak temperature reached, and then we dropped temperature of that product inside the canner. And then we climbed back up and we had another period of time where peak temperature was reached, but then again, we lost that temperature. So it's very fluctuating and goes up and down and up and down. And therefore, we cannot endorse or get behind in any way using electric pressure cookers to replace a canner. Go ahead and cook your pot roast in there. Go ahead and make your cheesecake in there. Yeah, you can make cheesecake in an electric pressure cooker. They're pretty awesome. But do not use them for canning, even if it was sold and marketed and you have instructions for how to use it as a canner. It is not safe. So while we're talking about unsafe methods of canning, let's just jump right on that train. And at one point, we had science and we had research that said, this is how we need to do things to be safe. And that was 40, 50, 60 or more years ago. And there are still people that swear that that is the only way to do things. They've not kept up with where the science, the food science, has taken them. And so we do know now a whole lot more than we did decades, even a few years ago. And so we know that we can safely say we cannot get behind open kettle canning methods. Open kettle canning methods simply involve putting hot food into a jar, putting the cover on, and letting nature take its course and letting a vacuum seal form. So that was not a processed product. You simply put hot food into a jar, put the cover on, and waited for a vacuum seal to form. Vacuum seal will form, but it's a very weak seal, and you didn't process that food at the correct temperature to kill microorganisms and bacteria. The inversion method, this is one of my absolute favorites, where you simply take a jar of food, you fill that up, you take a jar, you fill it with your hot food, then you flip it upside down overnight on the counter. When you pick it up tomorrow morning when it's cold, voila, there's a vacuum seal. Same as the open kettle method. There was no processing that happened. That food did not come to safe temperatures and get heated throughout to a safe temperature. And all you did was create a pretty weak vacuum seal. So not something we can get behind. We also have other unsafe canning methods. The oven canning. This came up a few years ago, and it just seems like everyone's telling me how great it is to can in the oven. Does not come to the right temperature. Canning jars were created to withstand wet heat. They were never created to withstand dry heat. And the oven temperature is dry heat. So our jars are far more likely to break under those dry heat conditions than they are in wet heat conditions. So that alone right there is one big no-no. But again, with that dry heat, you don't have that hot water circulating around your jars and beneath your jars and above your jars to make sure that the outside parts and the core parts of the food inside that jar are getting to a safe temperature. So it's important for the outside parts of the food, you know, that side that's out here on the edge of the jar, as well as that food that's in the center, right in the core. That's as important to get to the right temperature as the outside. And that's why we have certain times that foods need to process for, because we know when we have a probe inside those jars, inside the canner, what temperature and for how long it takes for the core of that food to get to a safe temperature. Oven canning does not allow for that. We also want to say goodbye to paraffin wax on the tops of our jams and jellies. Again, at one time, that was the gold standard. I volunteer at the fair every year, and we used to see lots of jars come in with paraffin wax on the top of the jars. We know now that after a very short period of time, that paraffin wax dries and shrinks and pulls from the edges of that glass jar, creating an opening for bacteria, molds, yeast to get in. And with the addition of oxygen that can also make it in, we end up with mold on our jars. If you're like I am, when I was growing up, if there was a little bit of mold in the jelly jar, your mother just scraped that off. Not going to throw that jar of jam away. That's good stuff. We're not wasting. Scrape that moldy part off and spread another chunk on your toast and you were good. We know now that if we looked at that under a microscope, that if there's enough bacteria or mold spores in that food to actually bloom on the surface in the presence of oxygen, that there's a whole lot more within that food that just hasn't had the opportunity to come to the surface and bloom, but it's there. So foods are filled with mold spores. If it's enough to grow on the surface, assume it's through and through, throw it out. So that is why paraffin wax sealing of foods is no longer recommended or accepted as a good practice. And then there's other ideas that are born from the misinformation that's spread all over the internet, because if you can find it on the internet, it must be true, right? So please don't can in the dishwasher. So many red flags, just don't do it. Okay, I'm not even going to get into why you don't do it. Just don't ever, ever, ever entertain the notion of canning in the dishwasher. Don't can in your electric pressure cooker. We mentioned that one. And don't can in your slow cooker or crock pot. Again, who dreams these things up? I don't know, but don't do it. Just don't do it. You have the best practices right here in front of you. I know we're past time. I'm just simply waiting for this to drop down so that we can take our jars out. But I do understand if you need to leave us at this point, I won't hold it against you. I do want to make sure that you know that next month we'll be back on August 19th. And we're going to be using the electric pressure cooker, and we're going to be looking, because it's back to school time, we're going to be looking at making some quick meals using your electric pressure cooker. And I've got some great ideas up my sleeve that we're going to be trying out on August 19th. On September 23rd, we'll be talking about dehydrating and freezing as two other methods of food preservation. October 28th, we'll go back to our electric pressure cooker and we'll be cooking up a variety of soups and stews that you can make in an electric pressure cooker. And in November, we'll be tackling some of those holiday classics that we can make in our electric pressure cooker so we can free the oven up to make holiday cookies, right? I think it's a great trade-off. I do want to let you know that there are some other classes that are going to be coming up that you can find on our webpage, University of Maine Cooperative Extension. And on August 10th, there's going to be a webinar on making salsa that runs from noon to 12:45. On September 14th, there'll be a class offered again on pressure canning from 12 to 12:45 if you wanted to have a refresher course. October 12th from 12 to 12:45, we will be tackling fermenting on that webinar. And then in November, we will be tackling and talking about some terrific gifts you can make from your kitchen using some of the great foods that you've preserved over the summer. We will be offering a couple of classes at the Northern Maine Fair in a new series we're calling Extension Talks, kind of like TED Talks. August 7th and 8th, we'll be covering water bath canning basics and pressure canning basics. We'll be at the exhibit hall from 7 to 8 o'clock each of those nights, and that's a free class. And on August 25th, at Northern Maine Community College from 10 to 12, and again, a repeat class from 6 to 8, we will be talking about canning, and AR Gould is sponsoring that class. And the limits to the class will be 12 people per class, and each participant, I've been told, will receive a ball blue book for coming to the class. And just make sure, Sharon, do we have any more questions that people might have?
No, I believe, well, Heidi does say, thank you for sharing this information about gauge testing. Can you also speak to how one would know whether your seal needs to be replaced?
So I'm guessing that's the seal, the gasket inside the lid that you're talking about. It's a great question, and thank you for bringing it up because I didn't talk about that. So inside your Miro or your Presto brand of pressure cookers, there's going to be a removable gasket in here. And that gasket is something that you want to make sure you check every year when you go to use your electric pressure cooker. And it should be supple and it should stay in the contours of the lid when it's put there. So if you go to put your gasket back in your lid and you flip it over and it falls out, it's been stretched out and it no longer fits nicely and should be replaced. If also, when you take that out and you inspect it and you bend it and it starts to become brittle and kind of like dry rot, that's another indicator that it's lost its elasticity and its suppleness, and you want to replace that gasket. If you have the brand of canner, I believe it's American Harvest, the gasket is built in and it does not come out. So you have to check with your manufacturer. I don't know if you need to replace the entire lid at that point, but check with the manufacturer on how to upgrade your gasket. I should also mention that when we talk about dial gauge testing at our offices, that free service, our testing units are not equipped to test American Harvest products. So it's only Miro and Presto that can be tested on those units. So I'm glad that that came up here because I did want to mention that. Heidi, does that answer your question about the gasket? Every time you're ready to put your canner away for the year, a really great maintenance tip is to take a little bit of salad oil, just vegetable oil, and rub that around on that gasket so it's glistening and soft, and that will help keep that lubricated in storage. And it's also recommended if you're going to be storing your pressure cooker for a period of time, not to store it with the lid clamped on in place because that crushes that gasket. So it's recommended to invert the lid and store it with the lid inverted so that you're not putting a lot of pressure on that gasket while it's in storage. Any other questions?
There aren't any other questions right now, but Heidi does say, yes, that answers hers, and thank you.
Super. And again, we're just waiting for the pressure to drop fully out of this pot, and I'm sorry that it hasn't cooperated better with us. I thought by starting as early as I did, that would certainly make it possible to see inside the jar. What I do want to tell you is that if you have a pressure cooker, a pressure canner, excuse me, a pressure canner, you can use a pressure canner as a pressure cooker, but you may not use a pressure cooker as a pressure canner, if that makes sense. So if you do use your pressure canner to prepare things like chickens and cuts of meat and vegetables and soups and things, you do want to make sure that you are cleaning out your vent tube each time, because if you get any kind of meat or vegetable or seeds or spices stuck in that vent tube, it will not function properly. That'll cause a clog. You won't be able to release steam, and that will build way too much pressure. You'll have to turn the heat off, let any pressure fall out of the pot before trying to figure out what's wrong. So you always want to make sure that you clean that vent tube before each use. If you were using your pressure canner to cook savory items like those roasts and chickens, you would want to be able to stop the cooking process almost immediately once the cook time was up. And you would do that by lifting up the whole pot, putting it into your sink, and running cold water over the cover of that. That's going to drop the pressure out really fast. And that's okay if you're a pot roast. Doesn't matter if you go through high pressure to zero pressure in a very short period of time. You would not want to do that same process with your canning jars, because when you drop the pressure that fast, that's a higher potential for you to have broken jars. Yay, we just had our lid drop. So I just want to grab the camera here real quick, Sharon, if you don't mind switching over. And we're going to show you that lock has dropped down now so that it's flush with the lid itself. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the canner, and so I'm going to remove my gauge, take that right off, and it came right off and it didn't hiss at me because there's no pressure in there. And then I'm going to twist carefully. Now this is still full of hot, hot, hot steam, and I'm going to always use my lid as a shield and open so that it protects me from that steam. So I'll open that up just like this, and I'm protected from all that steam coming out of it. Super. I'm going to set that aside, and my jars are still boiling. The contents of my jars are still boiling. And Sharon, if you want to flip to the other camera, I'm going to use my jar lifter and I'm bringing that right over here. Hopefully you can see. I don't know if you can see that that is still boiling in there. I'm going to come in here and grab another one. Maybe, I think you can see some of the boiling still going on inside that jar. Now I'm going to refuse the urge to tip these jars and try to get that puddle of water off the top, because I want my seal to form without food going side to side in there now. And that's a really good picture. You can see the contents of the liquid in there really boiling. You can also see that there are no more purple beans. They're all either green or yellow. And here's my last jar coming out. Gonna leave a little bit of space between these jars so cool air can circulate around them and they can cool down naturally on their own. I'm gonna leave them alone now. In fact, when I leave this class tonight and clean up, I'm gonna leave the jars here for overnight, and I'm not gonna come check them until tomorrow. So once the jars come out of the hot canner, you leave them 12 to 24 hours. So they're cold and they've had an opportunity to seal on their own. After that time, when you check them, go ahead and you're gonna tap that lid down to see if it stays down or if it goes clicky, 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 clicky. You don't want to hear this sound. That's an unsealed lid. Okay, you want to make sure that when you rub your finger over that there's an indentation. That concave lid will let you know that a vacuum seal is in there and that food is now, that jar is shelf stable. When you remove your jars from the canner and they have all sealed, you want to take those screw bands off like we talked about. You want to wipe down your jars just in case any liquid from inside did ooze out. We've heard our first sealed jar. You want to wipe that down so no bacteria, second sealed jar, no bacteria grows on the side of that jar, which could interfere with the lid while that's in storage. Make sure to label and date, and just putting beans with July 2021 is going to be sufficient. But I will tell you that I don't use cloves in my pickled beets. And pickled beets and canned beets look an awful lot alike. And I had a lot of jars of open pickled beets in my refrigerator at one time because I was sure I'd remember which were the pickled beets. And so just label, just label. A lot of people will use a Sharpie and label right on the lid on the top because that reminds them they're not going to reuse that lid. That's great. Some people buy the little labels and put fancy little labels on, and their shelves in their pantries are all lined up and look beautiful. I'm cheap. I use masking tape and it works just great. So whatever is your druthers, that's great. You want to can as much as you can use in a year. That's what the USDA tells me I have to tell you. I don't know who else is going to watch this video, so it's not uncommon for people to can 2 years worth at a time. But I'm supposed to tell you that as a USDA employee, you're only supposed to can as much as you can use in a year's time. Take that with a grain of salt. So I believe we have, so when you are storing, just another real quick word here. I did have a woman that I canned with once that called me in the middle of the winter that all of her jars of beans had broken their seals in storage. And we checked, and I know that we had done everything correctly. I know that her jars were clean. When she showed me her jars, they did not have any mold growing on them. So mold hadn't grown up and expanded under the lid to break that seal. The only thing we could determine was the factors that she had stored her jars of beans up against the chimney wall in her basement. She had shelving that went up alongside the chimney. All the jars that were touching the chimney were the ones that had broken their seals. And all we could guess, and I've never seen it documented anywhere, but I can only guess that every time the furnace kicked off and on and warmed up the chimney, that constant fluctuation of temperature all winter long finally just caused the seals to fail on all of those jars that were touching the chimney. So especially Daryl, if you have any experience with that type of thing, or if you've heard of that, you seem to have some experience canning, I'd love to hear from you if that has ever happened to you. That was my theory. You've got 3 seals. That was my theory. And so when you are storing, store in a cool, dry place out of direct sunlight, because light will fade out your jars and destroy nutrients in your jars. And store, if you have a particularly damp cellar, it's really important that you take the screw bands off your jars. Those will rust on pretty severely, almost making it impossible to open your jars. So if you have a very high humid, especially if you have actual water running through your basement, you do want to make sure that you remove those screw bands. So I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I'm sorry we ran over time. Yes.
We still have a few questions if you don't. Okay.
I don't mind if you don't mind.
Okay. Daryl mentioned that buy the gasket directly from the manufacturing site to get the newest stock hardware. To get the newest stock. Hardware stores may have had the gaskets languishing on the shelf for years. And he did suggest go to presto.com. It's very helpful at getting you at the right gasket for your model. Heidi.
And I will say, Daryl, thank you for that reminder. We do always recommend that people go to the manufacturer website for that very reason, because these do dry out, those gaskets, they will get dry rot. And if they've been hanging around under the ultraviolet lights in a hardware store for year after year after year, when you finally buy them, that product is already being compromised and isn't the best it could be. So you're absolutely right. You'll want to go to the either presto.com or miro.com equipped with your model number so that you can easily find your correct gasket on that website. Model number will either be on the handle or on the underside of the pot, sometimes on the underside of the lid, but it should be readily findable. Thanks for bringing that up. Heidi has a question.
Heidi just want to say thank you for tonight. And Daryl does make another comment that widely fluctuating temperatures can cause flat sour.
All right. So thank you for that, Daryl. Confirmation. Well, again, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I'm sorry we ran over time. Thank you for sticking it out with me. And I hope you have a wonderful bean season. They're just coming in up here in northern Maine, and everything seems to be coming in one thing after another. I think we'll be doing peas and carrots next, coming up very soon. So thank you all. Have a great night, and we'll see you hopefully next month. Bye-bye now.